Hello, my name is Josiah Zulauf from Ethnos 360 Bible Institute, Jackson, Michigan. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about different contexts in missions, specifically secular contexts in missions that don't have 100% to deal with just telling people the gospel. And I'm going to be specifically talking about missions in second and third world countries. Now, the first context I'm going to be looking at is the health context, which is very important considering many people who go over to second and third world countries have to deal with poor health care or poor living conditions that aren't so sanitary. So many people are sick and don't have the medicine or the hospitals to go to that will help them get better. So many missionaries who go over to those countries need to bring over medical supplies or vaccines or whatnot to be able to heal those people from whatever illnesses they have. Now what that does is, first and foremost, it keeps unbelievers living so they can die while they're believers, not while they're unbelievers. It also opens the door into sharing the gospel. So we think about like Jesus healing the physical need in the New Testament, but showing it as an example of the fact that he can also heal the physical need as well. Now, the big thing too that you have to realize and focus on is not just the health of the people you're speaking to and sharing the gospel with, but also the health of yourself. Because if you go to those countries and you don't take care of yourself and your own health and don't get the proper vaccines and you're sick and not feeling too hot, well then you won't be able to share the gospel with them anyways. Now the biggest pitfall and trap that people can fall into here is that they focus too much on just meeting a physical need. So like we see groups of doctors going to the tribal field and just handing out medicine and healing people and helping deliver babies and all that, and it's all good. But we have to realize that the need is more spiritual than physical. And if we focus too much on the physical need, then not enough of the spiritual need gets met. And that's why we're going. We haven't been entrusted with vaccines and needles and healthcare. The Great Commission does not tell us, go heal all types of disease. It says, go and preach the gospel. That's the biggest thing. Now, the next context I'm going to be talking about is the socioeconomic context. And this one's a little tougher because when you go to a second or third world country, the gap between the rich and the poor is huge. A lot different than we experience here in North America and specifically the States. Again, like the health context, the socioeconomic context, when we help the poor, we have an avenue into sharing the gospel. But again, that same warning needs to be delivered that we're not going there to help impoverished people, but we're going there to give them the gospel. Now, the socioeconomic context, the reason it's so difficult is because normally it's on a specific, like missionary to missionary basis on how they want to go about dealing with the rich or the poor. Since the gap is so big between the rich and the impoverished, many missionaries try to operate in the middle class, so they have the chance to reach the rich and have the chance to reach the poor as well. Normally what ends up happening is that the rich don't end up responding to the gospel, and only the lower classes end up getting saved. And many people can think, oh, well, that kind of stinks, because how are the lower classes going to make an impact? If we could just save the people in the upper class, maybe they could have such more of an impact. But I just want to point the attention to a verse in 1 Corinthians 1. 1 Corinthians 1, 26 and 27 says this: "For consider your calling, brothers, not many of you were wise according to worldly standards, not many were powerful, not many were of noble birth, but God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. So pretty much what Paul is saying is, it's okay if only the lower class get saved in that context, because God can use people who are of lower class to share the gospel with people who are of the upper class, who are higher classes. Now, another huge thing not to focus on is, the huge thing to focus on is to fight the idea of the prosperity gospel when preaching the gospel with people who are impoverished in those second and third world countries, because many of them can see us as Christians taking the gospel there. We're pretty wealthy, and we just want to be careful to avoid that idea of, if you're saved, if you're a believer, then you'll get good things and God will bless you and give you money. And even if we don't say that outright, a lot of times it can be perceived that way. Say we're helping out with their physical needs as a ministry to witness to their spiritual needs. They can see it as, if I become a Christian, if I believe in this God, I'll be rich and wealthy. And that's a huge misconception and something we really want to steer away from, especially in those second and third world countries where that's a huge issue. Now, the last context I'm going to be talking about is the cultural context, which is by far the hardest to try to plan for and to try to think about, and how to come to real practical conclusions when you're on the field out in, say, a tribal church plant or in a third world country trying to do missions. And one of the biggest reasons is because of culture shock. And that's defined as the missionaries' first confrontation with major cultural differences. And culture shock can actually be such a problem that many people, specifically the writer in our book for Bible Basis of Missions, says he has a suspicion that John Mark, who was just a monocultural Judean Jew, could have experienced culture shock. And that's one of the reasons that he would have left Paul and Barnabas. And Paul and Barnabas would have been bicultural Jews who would have had less of a problem with the cultural context. And the culture shock can have anything to do with any of these factors: language shock, changes in routine, relationships, loss of how to understand emotional things, or just being disoriented. So that's a huge thing. And the biggest thing with culture shock is just not to get discouraged when you go over to a third world country or a tribal church plant, and just realizing that happens to everyone, and the Lord can work through incredible things. And the next thing in the cultural context is identification. Now, identification is, in short, just when we go over to a culture, we want to become like those people and want to relate to their culture as much as possible. Now, identification is huge. It's crucial to ministry in second and third world countries, because one of the biggest ways that people share the gospel, that we can share the gospel, is through relationship. And if we are able to identify with their culture, then building that relationship becomes so much easier and creating a huge avenue into sharing the gospel. And some biblical basis for identification, it comes from Philippians 2, 6 through 7, where it says, "Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross." So we see that in the Bible, we are called to identification just as Christ identified with us as human beings. He came down and became a human being. We are called to identify with the cultures that we go to or minister to, even if that is a culture down the street. And that's about all I have about the secular context of missions. Thank you for listening, and a huge round of applause to my listeners, probably bored to death, Zeb and Joe. And thanks a bunch for listening. I'll keep it real, and peace.
Amen.